Chapter 1. If you watch people long enough, certain patterns become obvious. You see it in everyday places without even trying to analyze it. A coffee shop, a gym, a college campus, a mall, anywhere people gather long enough for conversations to start and eye contact to happen. Some men move through those spaces quietly, almost cautiously, like they're trying not to disturb anything. Other men move through the same space with a relaxed kind of presence that doesn't look rehearsed. The interesting thing about that difference is how women tend to react to it without much discussion ever happening about why. You might have noticed something similar before. Two men can walk into the same room and the energy around them feels different even before either of them says a word. One of them might be objectively better looking, better dressed, maybe even wealthier on paper. Yet the attention in the room drifts toward the other guy who seems completely comfortable occupying the space he's in. It's subtle enough that most people wouldn't stop to analyze it. Still, if you sit back and observe long enough, the pattern shows itself again and again. This is where many men begin forming complicated theories about attraction. They start thinking there must be some hidden formula behind why certain guys seem to connect with women easily, while others struggle to get a conversation going. The mind likes complicated explanations because complicated problems feel important. You hear discussions about techniques, psychological tricks, social hierarchies, all kinds of frameworks that promise to explain the whole thing in detail. Meanwhile, the real world keeps quietly showing a much simpler picture. Walk into almost any public place, and you'll see couples everywhere. You'll see average-looking guys holding hands with beautiful women. You'll see men who don't look particularly wealthy or famous, enjoying easy conversations with women who clearly enjoy being around them. None of those moments look like the result of complicated strategies. They look ordinary, almost casual. That observation alone can create an interesting question in a man's mind. If women were truly as difficult to connect with as some people claim, those scenes would be rare. Instead, they're everywhere. They happen in cities, small towns, workplaces, college campuses, parks, restaurants, and every other environment where people spend time together. The pattern repeats so often that eventually it becomes impossible to ignore. When you step back and really look at that pattern, something surprising starts revealing itself. Most women are simply responding to the emotional presence of the man standing in front of them. The presence he carries, the way he speaks, the way he holds eye contact, the way he seems comfortable being exactly where he is in that moment. That presence doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It doesn't involve rehearsed lines or carefully calculated behavior. It usually looks relaxed, almost ordinary. A man walks up to a woman, says something simple, smiles, and the conversation begins moving naturally from there. You've probably seen that exact scenario more times than you can count. Sometimes the guy isn't even particularly impressive by traditional standards. He's just comfortable. The conversation flows easily because he isn't trying to prove something. He isn't performing. He's simply interacting with another person. Many men overlook how powerful that simplicity actually is. Instead of noticing the relaxed interaction happening right in front of them, they focus on their own internal pressure about getting everything right. The mind becomes busy calculating outcomes before the conversation even starts. What should I say first? What if she rejects me? What if I look awkward? Those thoughts create tension before a single word is spoken. The tension leaks into the body language. It changes the tone of the voice. It even changes the way a man stands when he approaches someone he finds attractive. None of those changes happen intentionally. They're simply the physical expression of the internal pressure happening in his mind. Now, imagine the opposite scenario. A man approaches a woman with no complicated expectations attached to the interaction. He notices her, walks over, and says something simple because he felt like starting a conversation. His voice stays calm because he isn't measuring the outcome of every sentence. His body language stays relaxed because he's not trying to control how the moment unfolds. From the outside, that interaction looks effortless. In reality, it's simply the absence of unnecessary pressure. The conversation has room to breathe because neither person is carrying the weight of unrealistic expectations about what must happen next. This is where many men start realizing something that initially feels almost frustrating. The difficulty they experienced with women often came from the pressure they placed on themselves rather than from women themselves. When the pressure disappears, the interaction begins looking far more natural. You might remember a moment in your own life where a conversation with a woman flowed easily without you trying very hard. Maybe it happened when you weren't even focused on attraction at all. Maybe it happened at work, at school, or during some random situation where you simply started talking. The conversation felt normal because you weren't evaluating every word you said. Those moments reveal something important about human interaction. When two people communicate without the weight of expectation pressing on the moment, the connection has room to grow naturally. Humor appears more easily. Curiosity shows up in both directions. The conversation becomes an exchange instead of a performance. One of the most interesting things about this dynamic is how often men underestimate themselves inside these situations. A man might believe he's not attractive enough, not confident enough, or not interesting enough to capture a woman's attention. Meanwhile, the woman he's talking to might simply be responding to the ease of the interaction itself. People enjoy conversations that feel relaxed and genuine. That truth applies to friendships, business interactions, and romantic connections alike. The easier the conversation feels, the more likely both people are to remain engaged in it. If you think about the most enjoyable conversations you've had with anyone in your life, they probably didn't feel forced. They flowed naturally because both people felt comfortable expressing themselves without worrying about constant evaluation. The same dynamic applies when a man and a woman begin getting to know each other. The realization that attraction often grows out of simple, relaxed interaction can feel surprisingly freeing. Instead of trying to construct the perfect image of yourself before approaching someone, you begin focusing on the present moment. You speak because you have something to say. You listen because you're genuinely curious about the person standing in front of you. That shift changes the emotional atmosphere immediately. The interaction becomes lighter because you're no longer carrying the pressure of proving your worth through every sentence. The conversation becomes two people exploring a moment together rather than one person trying to impress the other. If you've ever experienced a moment where talking to a woman suddenly felt easy and natural, you already know what this feels like. Those interactions tend to stay in your memory because they reveal a version of yourself that feels relaxed and confident without effort. If that kind of moment comes to mind while you're listening to this, drop a comment and share where it happened. Those stories often remind people that connection doesn't require complicated strategies to exist. Once you start recognizing this pattern, something interesting happens to the way you view attraction entirely. The mystery begins dissolving. What once looked like an impossible challenge starts looking like an ordinary part of everyday human interaction. And that realization quietly changes the way you move through the world. Chapter 2. Once you start paying attention to those patterns, something else becomes visible that most men overlook for years. Women spend a large portion of their lives simply responding to the energy of the men around them. Not in some dramatic or mystical way, just in the same natural way people respond to any social environment. The tone of the room changes depending on who walks into it. Conversations feel lighter or heavier depending on the presence someone carries. The entire atmosphere of a moment shifts based on how comfortable people feel expressing themselves. If you watch closely in social settings, you'll see this play out over and over again. A group of people might be talking casually, everyone minding their own rhythm, when a certain guy walks into the circle. Sometimes that guy instantly tightens the energy in the room. He tries too hard to prove something, maybe speaking louder than necessary or pushing jokes that feel slightly forced. The atmosphere becomes awkward almost immediately. You can feel the room adjusting around him, Then you'll see the opposite situation happen somewhere else. Another man enters the same type of environment and nothing dramatic occurs. He greets people casually. He listens more than he talks at first. He looks relaxed, like he has nowhere else he urgently needs to be. Within minutes, the group feels more comfortable. Conversations flow easily around him without any effort on his part. The interesting thing about that second guy is how ordinary he usually looks. No theatrical confidence, no exaggerated charm, just a quiet sense of ease that communicates something without words. Women notice that energy quickly because it feels stable. Stability creates comfort, and comfort allows attraction to grow naturally in the background without anyone forcing it to happen. Many men assume women are evaluating them with some complex checklist every time they interact. They imagine women analyzing their appearance, their status, their financial potential, their personality traits all at once. That belief creates pressure before the interaction even begins. The moment you think you're being evaluated like a job interview candidate, your body language starts tightening automatically. What often happens in real life looks much simpler. A woman usually senses the emotional atmosphere around the interaction long before she forms any intellectual judgment about the man standing in front of her. She notices how relaxed he seems. She notices whether he appears comfortable with himself. She notices whether he's speaking naturally or performing. Those impressions happen quickly because humans are wired to read social signals instinctively. Imagine two different conversations happening in the same place. In the first one, the man approaches a woman while quietly evaluating himself with every step he takes. His mind is running through possible outcomes before he even speaks. When he finally says hello, the tension from those thoughts is already present in his voice and posture. She might not consciously understand why the interaction feels slightly heavy, but she senses it. Now picture another man starting the same conversation. He walks over because he felt like talking. That's the entire motivation. His tone stays calm because he isn't carrying a list of expectations. If the conversation becomes interesting, great. If it ends quickly, he continues his day the same way he would have anyway. That freedom from pressure changes how the moment feels for both people. You might have seen examples of this difference in your own life without labeling it that way. Maybe there was a guy in your social circle who always seemed to connect with women easily, even though he never looked like he was trying very hard. He joked, listened, responded naturally, and somehow conversations with him lasted longer than conversations with other men who seemed more polished. Those kinds of men rarely spend time worrying about whether women like them. They move through interactions assuming connection will either happen or it won't, and both outcomes are acceptable. That assumption removes the tension from their presence. Without realizing it, they create an environment where women feel free to engage with them comfortably. There's an interesting psychological effect behind this dynamic. When someone appears emotionally self-sufficient, the interaction stops feeling like a performance. The other person doesn't feel responsible for validating them. Instead, the conversation becomes an exchange where both people simply explore the moment together. That freedom tends to make the interaction more enjoyable for everyone involved. Many men spend years searching for complicated advice about how to attract women when the most powerful change often happens internally. The moment you stop treating every interaction like a test you must pass, the emotional atmosphere surrounding your presence begins shifting. Conversations feel lighter because you're not measuring them constantly. You might notice that women begin responding differently when you carry that relaxed energy. They smile more easily, they ask questions, they stay in conversations longer because the interaction feels comfortable instead of pressured. None of that happens because you memorized a specific technique. It happens because the emotional environment around you changed. There's a story that illustrates this point in a simple way. A guy once told me about a night he went out with friends after a long week of work. He wasn't thinking about dating at all. His mind was mostly focused on relaxing and catching up with people he hadn't seen in a while. At some point during the evening, he ended up talking to a woman near the bar. The conversation started over something small. They were both waiting for drinks, and he made a casual observation about the music playing in the background. She laughed, responded with her own comment, and suddenly they were talking about other things. The interaction stretched into 20 minutes without either of them noticing how much time had passed. Later that night, his friends pointed out something interesting. They said he looked more confident talking to her than they had ever seen him before. He laughed when they told him that because he hadn't been thinking about confidence at all. He had simply been enjoying the moment without trying to manage the outcome. That experience stuck with him because it showed him how different interactions feel when he wasn't carrying expectations into them. The conversation unfolded naturally because he wasn't trying to steer it toward a specific result. The connection happened because the atmosphere felt relaxed for both people. You might recognize moments like that in your own life as well. Conversations that seemed to grow effortlessly when you weren't focusing on whether the interaction would lead somewhere. Those experiences reveal something important about attraction. It often appears quietly in environments where people feel free to express themselves without pressure. If a moment like that comes to mind while you're listening to this, share it in the comments. A lot of men have experienced situations where connection happened easily once the pressure disappeared, and hearing those stories reminds people how natural attraction can actually be when the environment feels comfortable. Once that realization settles in, the whole idea of getting girls begins looking very different from the way it's often described. Instead of feeling like a complicated challenge, it starts looking like an extension of ordinary human interaction. And that shift in perspective changes how you approach every conversation that follows. Chapter 3. After a while, you start noticing something else that most men miss when they're younger. Women are far less mysterious than people make them sound. When you listen to conversations between women, when you observe how they behave around different types of men, when you see who they laugh with and who they feel comfortable around, the patterns begin repeating themselves so consistently that the whole thing stops looking complicated. It starts looking human. You'll see women talking about men in ways that sound surprisingly simple. They'll mention that a guy made them laugh. They'll say a certain guy is fun to be around. They'll talk about how relaxed they feel around someone who doesn't seem awkward or tense. Those comments might sound small, almost unimportant, yet they reveal a huge amount about what actually creates attraction in everyday life. The strange part is how often men overlook those signals because they're searching for something more dramatic. They imagine women are constantly analyzing status, strategy, or some hidden hierarchy that determines which men are worth their attention. Meanwhile, many women are simply responding to the emotional experience of interacting with someone. If the conversation feels good, the connection continues. If it feels tense, forced, or uncomfortable, the interaction fades naturally. Think about the last time you watched a group of people interacting in a social environment. It might have been a party, a restaurant, a campus courtyard, or even a casual gathering between friends. Look closely at the men who seem to have the easiest time connecting with women in those spaces. They're usually doing something surprisingly ordinary. They're talking, listening, laughing, reacting naturally to what's happening around them. None of that behavior looks calculated. In fact, the reason it works so well is because it doesn't feel calculated at all. People enjoy interacting with someone who feels real. Authentic reactions create a sense of safety inside the conversation. That safety allows curiosity and attraction to develop gradually without either person needing to force anything. You might have experienced the opposite situation before as well. A conversation where you felt like the other person was performing rather than simply talking. Maybe they were trying too hard to sound impressive. Maybe their jokes felt rehearsed. Maybe their compliments sounded exaggerated. Even if you couldn't explain why it felt strange, something about the interaction made you less interested in continuing the conversation. Women feel that same difference when they talk to men. When a man is performing, the interaction carries tension. When he's simply being present in the moment, the tension disappears. The conversation becomes easier to enjoy because no one is trying to control how it unfolds. This is where many men start realizing how much pressure they were placing on themselves for no reason. They spent years believing they needed to transform into some ideal version of themselves before women would respond to them. They thought they needed perfect confidence, perfect style, perfect lines to say at the right moment. The truth hiding behind those assumptions turns out to be much simpler. Women respond to men who feel comfortable being themselves in social situations. Comfort creates openness. Openness creates conversation. Conversation creates familiarity. Attraction often grows out of that familiarity when two people enjoy the experience of interacting with each other. You might be thinking about situations where you saw this happen right in front of you. Maybe there was a guy you knew who never seemed to worry about saying the perfect thing. He spoke casually, sometimes even awkwardly, yet women still seemed to enjoy being around him. The reason those interactions worked had very little to do with perfection and everything to do with presence. Presence is difficult to fake because it comes from how someone feels internally. A man who feels comfortable with himself doesn't spend every second analyzing how he's being perceived. His attention stays focused on the moment he's experiencing. That attention creates a connection between him and the person he's talking to. When a woman feels that kind of attention, the conversation naturally becomes more engaging. She feels heard. She feels like the interaction matters. The moment stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like a shared experience between two people. That shared experience becomes the foundation where attraction quietly begins forming. There's a small story that captures this idea in a very ordinary way. A man once described how he met his girlfriend during a completely unplanned conversation at a bookstore. He wasn't searching for anyone that day. He was looking through a shelf of books when a woman next to him made a comment about one of the titles. He laughed and replied with a joke about how long the book looked. The conversation that followed didn't contain anything extraordinary. They talked about books they liked, movies they had seen recently, places they wanted to travel. At some point, they realized they had been standing there talking for nearly 40 minutes. Neither of them planned for that conversation to last that long. It simply kept going because both people enjoyed the moment. When he told the story later, he said something interesting about that day. He said the conversation felt easy because he wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply responding to what she said and sharing his own thoughts naturally. That ease created a space where both of them felt comfortable continuing the interaction. Stories like that happen everywhere, every day. They rarely look dramatic from the outside, which is why people often overlook them when they're thinking about attraction. Yet those simple interactions reveal how easily connection can develop when the environment feels relaxed and genuine. Once you start recognizing how common those moments are, the entire idea of getting girls begins feeling different. The difficulty people talk about often comes from the pressure surrounding the interaction rather than the interaction itself. When the pressure disappears, conversations begin looking like ordinary exchanges between two curious human beings. You might already have examples of this in your own life. Times when a conversation with a woman lasted longer than you expected because neither of you felt rushed or evaluated during the interaction. If a memory like that comes to mind while you're listening to this, share it in the comments. Hearing about those moments reminds people how natural attraction can be when two people simply enjoy talking to each other. As this perspective settles in, the entire subject starts losing the intimidating weight many men attach to it. What once looked like a complicated challenge begins looking like a familiar social experience that humans have been navigating effortlessly for generations. Chapter 4. Something interesting begins happening once a man truly understands how ordinary attraction actually is. The pressure that used to sit on his shoulders during social interactions slowly disappears. He stops approaching conversations like they're important events that need to be managed carefully. The moment becomes lighter, because he's no longer carrying a quiet sense that something significant is at stake every time he talks to a woman. That shift changes more than the conversation itself. It changes how he moves through environments where women are present. His posture relaxes. His voice sounds steadier. His reactions become more natural because his mind isn't trying to monitor every detail of the interaction. What looks like confidence from the outside is often just the absence of pressure on the inside. You can see this transformation clearly when someone stops treating women like a special category of human beings that require different rules of communication. Instead, the interaction starts looking like any other social exchange. Two people meeting in a moment, sharing thoughts, reacting to each other's energy, seeing whether the conversation feels enjoyable enough to continue. When a man approaches conversations that way, something subtle happens to the emotional atmosphere around him. Women sense that he isn't trying to extract validation from the interaction. He isn't waiting for approval before allowing himself to feel comfortable. That independence creates a feeling of stability inside the conversation. Stability has a powerful effect on attraction because it allows people to relax. The moment someone feels like they're being evaluated or pressured to respond in a certain way, the interaction tightens immediately. When the conversation feels free from that pressure, curiosity becomes the natural response. People want to see where the moment might go because the experience itself feels enjoyable. There's an almost quiet confidence that appears when a man understands this. It doesn't look loud or theatrical. He isn't dominating conversations or trying to impress anyone. He simply participates in the moment fully because he's no longer worried about controlling the outcome. That calm presence becomes noticeable because it's rare in environments where many people are trying too hard to manage their image. Think about the difference between someone who's comfortable at a gathering and someone who feels like they're performing. The comfortable person might speak less at first. They observe the room, smile when something is funny, respond naturally when someone talks to them. Over time, the conversation drifts toward them because people enjoy interacting with someone who feels easy to be around. A lot of men underestimate how attractive that emotional ease can be. They assume women are searching for dramatic displays of confidence or status. Meanwhile, many women are simply responding to how the interaction feels. If the conversation feels relaxed, they stay. If the moment carries tension or awkward pressure, they move away from it naturally. This becomes especially clear when you notice how women behave around men who aren't trying to impress them. You might see a woman laughing more easily, asking questions, sharing stories from her own life, because the environment feels safe enough for her to do so. That openness appears because the man she's talking to isn't forcing the interaction in any particular direction. You've probably seen moments like this happen around you without thinking much about them at the time. A casual conversation begins somewhere unexpected. Two people talk longer than either of them planned. The energy around them looks comfortable and easy. Friends watching from a distance might even joke about how obvious the connection looks. Those scenes happen so often that they're easy to ignore. Yet they reveal something important about how human attraction works. When people feel relaxed around each other, the interaction becomes enjoyable. Enjoyment invites curiosity. Curiosity allows attraction to grow naturally without anyone needing to push it forward artificially. The reason this realization feels powerful for many men is because it removes the illusion that women are somehow unreachable or difficult to connect with. Once the pressure dissolves, the interaction begins looking like a conversation between two people who are simply exploring whether they enjoy each other's presence. A man who carries that perspective moves through the world differently. He doesn't hesitate as much before starting conversations because he no longer treats them like high-stakes situations. He notices women the same way he notices anyone interesting in his environment. If he feels like talking, he does. If the conversation ends quickly, he continues his day without attaching meaning to the outcome. That freedom has a strange side effect. The more relaxed he becomes about the interaction itself, the more women begin responding positively to his presence. They sense the lack of pressure in his behavior. The conversation becomes lighter because he isn't trying to control it. You might remember times when a conversation with a woman felt unexpectedly easy and fun, even though you weren't trying very hard. Maybe it happened when you were distracted with something else and simply started talking without thinking about it. Those moments reveal what interaction looks like when your attention stays on the present instead of the outcome. If an experience like that comes to mind while you're listening to this, share it in the comments. A lot of men have stories where a connection formed naturally once they stopped worrying about whether the interaction would succeed or fail. Hearing those moments reminds people how often attraction grows out of ordinary conversations. The longer a man carries this perspective, the more normal these interactions begin to feel. Talking to women becomes part of everyday life rather than a special event that requires preparation or strategy. That normalization changes the emotional tone of every interaction he has going forward, and when something becomes normal instead of intimidating, the entire experience becomes easier to navigate without overthinking it. That's the point where many men finally realize the idea they once heard sounds less like a bold claim and more like a simple observation about how people actually connect with each other. The truth quietly reveals itself through repeated experiences. Once you see the pattern clearly enough times, it becomes difficult to unsee it. Chapter 5. After a while, the entire subject starts feeling strangely ordinary. The same thing that once seemed confusing or intimidating begins looking like a normal part of everyday life. You walk through the same places you always have, yet the interactions around you start appearing differently. Conversations between men and women no longer look mysterious. They look familiar. They look human. You see people talking at cafes, laughing together in grocery store lines, standing outside buildings finishing conversations that clearly lasted longer than either of them expected. Those scenes used to look like something special happening to other people. Now they look like the natural result of two individuals sharing a moment without pressure weighing down the interaction. The shift inside your own mindset becomes noticeable in quiet ways. You don't pause as long before saying hello to someone you find interesting. The hesitation that once filled your mind with questions loses its strength because the situation no longer feels like a complicated test. It feels like what it actually is. One person acknowledging another person and seeing where the moment goes. That simplicity changes how your body reacts during those interactions. Your voice stays steady because you're not measuring every word against an imaginary standard. Your eye contact feels natural because you're not constantly wondering how you're being perceived. The entire interaction moves at the pace of the conversation itself instead of the pace of your internal worries. Women notice that shift immediately even if they can't explain exactly why. People are extremely sensitive to emotional energy in social environments. They feel when someone is tense. They feel when someone is relaxed. When the tension disappears from your presence, the conversation becomes easier for both of you to enjoy. You might remember a moment where someone told you that you seemed confident, even though you didn't feel like you were doing anything special. That kind of comment usually appears when someone notices how comfortable you seem in the interaction. Confidence in those moments often looks like calmness rather than intensity. It looks like a man who's content to be exactly where he is. That calmness creates an interesting ripple effect in social environments. When one person feels relaxed, the other person begins relaxing too. The conversation becomes easier because neither side feels the pressure to perform or impress. The moment becomes an exchange instead of a competition. There's something quietly powerful about realizing how simple that exchange can be. For years, many men carried the belief that connecting with women requires extraordinary effort or complicated strategies. When that belief finally dissolves, the whole experience begins feeling lighter. The interaction stops looking like a challenge to overcome and starts looking like a normal part of meeting people in the world. At that point, you begin noticing how often opportunities for conversation appear naturally during the day. A woman standing next to you in line, someone sitting near you in a cafe, a brief moment where eye contact happens and a smile appears. Those small openings used to feel intimidating because they carried the weight of expectation. Now they feel like ordinary moments that might turn into conversations if you feel like speaking. Sometimes those conversations last only a few seconds. Other times, they stretch into something longer. Occasionally, they lead to a deeper connection that continues beyond that initial moment. Each outcome becomes part of the same natural rhythm of human interaction. The more experiences you accumulate with that perspective, the clearer the pattern becomes. Attraction rarely appears through force or strategy. It grows in environments where two people feel comfortable sharing space and conversation without pressure distorting the moment. This realization doesn't turn every interaction into success. There will always be conversations that end quickly. There will be moments where the other person simply isn't interested in continuing. Those situations stop feeling like rejection once you understand the broader picture. They become normal parts of social life rather than personal failures. That mindset frees you from the emotional roller coaster many men experience while trying to meet women. Your mood no longer depends on whether one particular interaction goes well. You continue moving through your day the same way you would have anyway. Conversations become opportunities rather than tests. You might even start noticing something else happening once that freedom settles in. Women sometimes initiate conversations with you as well. They comment on something you said earlier. They ask a question about something you mentioned. The interaction begins flowing in both directions because the environment feels relaxed enough for either person to engage. Those moments reinforce the idea that attraction is often a shared process rather than a performance carried entirely by one person. When the emotional atmosphere feels comfortable, both people contribute naturally to the interaction. The conversation becomes something you're creating together instead of something one person is trying to control. Think back to the first part of this conversation where we talked about observing patterns in everyday life. The couples you see walking through parks, sitting in restaurants, standing together in ordinary places around the world. None of those connections looked complicated from the outside. They looked like two people who met, talked, and discovered they enjoyed each other's presence enough to keep spending time together. That pattern repeats everywhere because it's built into the way human beings connect with each other. Once you recognize how simple the foundation of that process actually is, the mystery surrounding it fades away. The same interactions that once felt intimidating begin looking familiar and approachable. If you've had a moment in your life where a conversation with a woman unexpectedly turned into something meaningful simply because the interaction felt easy and natural, share that story in the comments. A lot of people discover that their best connections began in moments where they weren't trying to force anything at all. And if this perspective shifted how you see those everyday interactions, consider subscribing and sharing the video with someone who might still be carrying that unnecessary pressure around social situations. Sometimes, hearing a simple truth explained clearly is enough to change how someone moves through the world from that point forward.